How do we define what home is? How do we define who we are in relationship to where we're supposed to be? Because we all have different ideas about this, right? We all understand that home can mean different things to different people. For some of us, maybe it's that ancestral homestead out in East Texas, right? Maybe that old chimney is still there and you can still drive by and see where your great-great-great-grandparents were. Or maybe it's your people. As long as I'm with my people, I'm home. Maybe I know a lot of you are vets, and home was wherever you were told to be at that particular moment. And that was home, and that worked for you. But from a scriptural perspective, when we talk about home in the Bible, it's actually talked about quite a bit. If you have a moment, turn to 2 Corinthians chapter 5. I want you to notice as we read through this, the vocabulary that Paul uses to describe his situation. He talks about tense, he talks about permanency, he talks about temporary, he talks about home. He says this starting in verse 1 of chapter 5. For we know that if the tent that is our earthly home is destroyed, we have a building from God, a house not made with hands, eternal in the heavens. For in this tent we groan, longing to put on our heavenly dwelling. If indeed by putting it on we may not be found naked. For while we are still in this tent, we groan, being burdened, not that we would be unclothed, but that we would be further clothed, so that what is mortal may be swallowed up in life. He who has prepared us for this very thing is God, who has given us the Spirit as a guarantee. So we are always to be of good courage. We know that while we are at home in the body, we are away from the Lord. For we walk by faith, not by sight. Yes, we are of good courage, and we would rather be away from the body and at home with the Lord. So wherever we are, at home or away, we make it our aim to please Him. Do you notice how Paul is describing all this? He's talking about two different variations of home, right? We've got an earthly home and we've got a heavenly home. And we all know from Paul's perspective where he would rather be. But look at this vocabulary. He talks about tents are earthly, a building from God, this tent that we groan in, right? We're going to talk about that in a little bit more detail later. He says, while we are at home in the body, we are distant or we are removed from God. And then he says this, we walk by faith and not by sight. An interesting context for that statement, because he's talking here about where home is, right? We understand that by faith there is a heavenly home, a heavenly dwelling for us, a place for us to be. And that is not something we can see. We take it by faith. And of course, Paul says he would rather be away from the body, home with the Lord. So where do we go with this? I mean, there's all sorts of different directions we could talk about, but as I mentioned, we're going to talk about Abraham. The passage that was read in the scripture reading is one that we have heard so many times, but before we get into any detail, I want you to think with me about this. Abraham was a regular guy. He lived in a regular town. He loved his wife. He worked. They didn't have any kids, but they had a home, right? They had a house that they lived in this city. God comes to them and says, it's time to go. Abraham went. Now, it's not hard to imagine the conversations that went on between Abraham and Sarah during this point, right? So God says to Abraham, it's time to go. He goes to Sarah and says, it's time to go. And she says, why? Where? For how long? He didn't have any of those answers, does he? So how many of us, if God came to us and said, it's time to go, you're leaving. When? Monday. You're going. How many of us would go home and start packing, right? I mean, we would have some issues with that. And there would be some explaining to do, no doubt. And yet they went. And so what was it that they were after? Were they after some new piece of ground that was better than the piece of ground that they had previously? Is that was the point? Was the promised land about dirt? Some kind of physical boundaries? Well, of course, they realized that. They were given that. At least their descendants were. But that really wasn't the point, was it? When we talk about looking for a home, when Abraham was searching for a home, he was not searching for a new piece of ground, a new place to build a new house. That wasn't the point. It says that he, by faith, went to live in a land of promise, as in a foreign land. But he was looking forward to this city, not a city or a house that he built, not a situation that he created, right? He was living in tents, temporary dwellings in a place that was foreign to him, very representative of us. We get so tied down to the physical things that we have right here. This is my house, this is my family, this is my job, this is my bank account, this is my car, these things. Abraham was taught the hard way that those things are not home. Those things do not constitute who we are, where we belong. Because isn't that what home is about? It's about belonging, right? Where do I belong? Well, it's really easy to tell from Paul's writings where he thought he belonged, and it wasn't here. He very much was clear on that point. So let's look at this a little bit further. They were looking for a city who was built, that was designed by God. A city in contrast to a tent, which is just a piece of fabric that was laid on the ground, opposed to a home, a house that had permanency, it had foundations, but not only that, it was designed by God himself. So when we look at this, let's look at a little bit further on in Hebrews chapter 11. Later on in verse 13, the writer starts talking in depth more about this, but he's not just talking about Abraham and Sarah now. He's talking about all these individuals who had gone before. And he says this, "These all died in faith, not having received the things promised, but having seen them and greeted them from afar, and having acknowledged that they were strangers and exiles on the earth. For people who speak thus make it clear that they are seeking a homeland. And if they had been thinking of the land which they had gone out, they would have an opportunity to return. But as it is, they desire a better country, that is, a heavenly one. Therefore God was not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared for them a city." How do we find home? Through faith, right? We walk by faith and not by sight. It's no coincidence that Paul is using this language of faith and sight in context of home. Paul believed that his home was not here. We have songs about this, right? We sing it all the time. This world is not my home. And yet, it kind of is. We live here, right? We sojourn here. We tent here. We have things to do here. We have responsibilities here, things we have to take care of, right? That is life. But the danger for all of us is when we stop seeing by faith and start seeing with our eyes, seeing what is in front of us, the physical things that are in front of us, and thinking that that is what constitutes belonging, thinking that's what constitutes where I belong. I belong here because my stuff is here. My people are here. Well, what if your people aren't here? What if your stuff isn't here anymore? Okay? Becomes a very existential question for us, because if I identify with all these things that surround me, these physical things, and I say, this is where I belong because these things are here, what then? What happens when they're not here? Do I put my faith in these things? Do I put my hope in these things? Is that what I'm hoping for? I'm hoping that my 401k doesn't get demolished this year and I can retire on schedule. I mean, is that what we're hoping for? Is that the end game in all this? And obviously the answer to that is no. But saying that and not doing that are two very different things, right? We understand it's easy to say that I am not rooted here. I am temporarily here, okay? This is my temporary duty, that this will come to a conclusion, that everything I see that I think is permanent, everything that I think is important, all this is going to go away, okay? It's temporary. It's temporal. What we're talking about here is this distinction between what is eternal, what is spiritual, and what is temporal. How do we find home? We have to see it through faith. We can't see it with our physical eyes. We can't touch it. We can't grasp it. Just like Abraham, he knew the land he was dwelling on as a foreigner, as an exile. He knew that would be his and his descendants. But he never saw it. He never saw it with his eyes. He saw it through faith. Hope. Job is a book that has long perplexed and caused arguments and opinions about many different items. The problem of suffering and all these things. And I find it interesting, people always ask, Why do bad things happen to good people, right? I mean, we hear that all the time. This is one of the major, I'm not trying to be mean, but excuses for not dealing with God, right? Because I just can't understand why bad things happen to good people. No one ever stops to ask, why do good things happen to bad people? Is that not the same question? We look at this stuff and we fail to grasp that life is hard. We live in a fallen world. We are surrounded by darkness and sin. That is the reality, and that's true for everybody. Believer, unbeliever, right? Sometimes bad things happen. Sometimes it's God that causes our suffering to discipline us. He very clearly says that. Sometimes the enemy torments us, as is the case with Job. Sometimes it's just time and chance, and frankly, sometimes it's just my own poor choices. This is the reality of the world we live in, right? So when we talk about why do bad things happen to good people, it's because bad things happen to everybody. No exception. But in Job, he offers a different perspective. And I used to think Job was about suffering. I mean, if somebody were to ask you, what's Job about? Well, this guy who suffered. But it's really not, in my opinion anyway. The word hope is used 21 times in the book of Job. The only time in the Bible it's used more is in Psalms, which is only 28. Now, if you think about that for a moment, how could a word like that, hope, show up that many times in this kind of book? Because it wasn't about the suffering. Okay, that wasn't the point of the book. Yes, he suffered, but there's like 30 chapters after the suffering to talk about hope, where his hope was, what he was looking forward to. One of the passages, and this was brought up, I believe, last week, Job 13:15. Though he slay me, I will hope in him, yet I will argue my ways to his face. You understand what he's saying there? He's at the point where he has lost every single thing he has, all right? Everything he's built, all of his wealth is gone. His children are gone. His wife has turned on him, right? His friends have turned on him. And he is struck with this horrible disease. And yet, he says, even to the point of death, even if God just flat out kills me right now, if he ends it, which I don't know if he would have really been upset about, to be honest, based on some of the things he said. But nevertheless, even to that point, he says, I will hope. Well, what's he hoping for? Everything's gone. There's nothing left. What's his hope? But he says this later in chapter 19. And please note what he says. I mean, most people think that this story or this account was about contemporary with Abraham, okay? This is old material. He says, for I know that my Redeemer lives, and that the last he will stand upon the earth. And listen to what he's saying here. This is so impressive. And after my skin has been thus destroyed, yet in my flesh will I see God. You realize he is arguing and affirming the bodily resurrection. I mean, 1 Corinthians 15. This is what he's doing. He's saying, my flesh is gone, right? It's wasting away. As far as he knew, he was on the clock, right? He wasn't going to make it. And he says, even though this body, this flesh, will be gone, it will disappear, it'll turn to dust, he says, yet in my flesh will I see God. He knew that he was going to be resurrected. He knew that he was going to be given a new body. As awful as everything was that was going on at that moment, that was his hope. Do you really believe that Job would have survived everything that happened? Would he have gotten through it intact with his faith whole if he did not have hope? If he did not have faith in that hope? We talk about hope, right? Well, I hope this, I hope that. But then we don't connect that we have to have faith in that hope. We have the hope of the resurrection, right? I mean, we're here because of the resurrection. Every one of us is in this pew today because of the resurrection. That's our hope. But only if we believe it. Only if we believe in that. So we have to understand that faith and hope go together. And here we see Job, who has lost everything. There's nothing left physically for him to hope in. All of it's been removed. And now he's on display for his friends and for everyone else. And he says, I still have my hope. What if Job's hope was in his kids? seeing his kids grow up, seeing his grandkids. What if that was his hope? What if his hope was in his health? What if his hope was in his marriage? What then? Where would he have been? Where would he have ended up? This whole story would have been entirely different. In fact, we probably wouldn't know it because it would have been lost in the dustbin of history. It was only because his hope was not rooted in the things around him, the possessions he had, the people that were around him. That was not his hope. He hoped for something much bigger. In 1 Thessalonians 4:13, he says, "But we do not want you to be uninformed, brothers, about those who are asleep, that you may not grieve as others do who have no hope." You realize he's not saying you're not going to grieve. He's saying you're going to grieve with hope. I think sometimes we read this passage and think we're supposed to not grieve when someone passes or moves on. We just think, well, they're in heaven now and I'm supposed to be okay with that. Well, that's not what he's saying. He's saying grieve. Absolutely grieve. But know that they are there. Know that's where you will be. It's much like when David lost his child. Do you remember what he said? He was praying and fasting and all these things, and the child dies. And he gets up, washes, eats, and everyone's confused. Why are you doing this? He just died. He says, no, he will not come to me, but what? I will go to him. Okay? That's what this is. This is grieving with hope. You know, you are convinced, you have faith that there is something bigger, something better, something that is permanent waiting for you when this is over. Finally, at least for this section, don't worry. We get there through hope, through faith. We do it with hope, and we do it in love. When Jesus in Matthew 22 was asked about the greatest commandment, he said, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and so on. The reasoning for that is that the entire Bible, Old and New Testament, the Torah, the law, was all grounded in very simple principles, and there are two of them. You love God, and you love your neighbor. Now, I was teaching a class a few years ago, and one of the individuals who was in there said something that was just brilliant. She said, the entire Bible is a commentary on how to do those two things. The entire book of Leviticus, right? How do I love God the way he expects to be loved? All of this interaction, all of these stories, all of the laws, the 600 and some odd laws in the Torah, all of that is to teach us how to love God and love each other. Think about what Paul said in Romans chapter 13. He says, owe no one anything except to love each other, for the one who loves his brother has fulfilled the law. Well, how is it just loving my brother fulfilling the law? Well, he goes on and explains later on. He says, love does no wrong to a neighbor, therefore love is fulfilling the law. We need to understand this, right? When we're talking about how do I find home, you don't get there without love. Read 1 John. You don't get there without love. If you do not love your neighbor, love your brother, you don't make it. You don't find it. You don't know what it looks like because our home is in heaven and it is all about love. We talk about you can't take it with you, okay? But you know what you do take with you is love, right? Love continues. Love is in heaven. It's there. The love that we share, the love that we build, the love that we, cultivate in others, these things continue. Paul talks about this when he talks about spiritual gifts. He's talking about how much better, endure these three things, faith, hope, and love. But the greatest of these is love. Well, why is that? Well, because faith becomes sight, and it's no longer faith anymore. We understand that, right? When we see Jesus, our faith's done because it's not necessary. We see him. Well, how about our hope? We don't need hope anymore. Hope's realized. It's here. We see it. But love continues. God's love for us, our love for him. These things continue. I think we kind of miss this, that somehow if I say love, I mean I don't have to obey. And I don't know where that comes from. Jesus himself said, if you love me, you'll keep my commandments. Why? Because his commandments are love. I know what love your enemy means, right? You do too. We know what that means. Anybody doing a good job at that? Because I'm not. And I'll be completely honest, I am not good at that. If they leave me alone and they don't talk to me, I can be polite. That's really not what he's talking about, is it? How about when they nail me to a cross? Am I going to love them then? No, I'm not. And I'm just being honest, all right? This is who we are. This is what we're about. When Jesus said, pick up your cross and follow after me, that wasn't a metaphor. That was literal. Go to the cross with me. Share in my fate. Do what I did. This is who we are. We act in love because love is the number one and most significant thing in the entirety of the Bible. When God says, you love me with everything you are, and I'm going to teach you how to do that correctly. You love your neighbor just like you love your own body, just like you love yourself, and I'm going to show you how to do that correctly. That's what God means when he says love. We have to do it through faith. There's no other way. We cannot see it. We cannot realize it unless we have faith. We have to hope in it. We have to know it's there. We have to believe that, and we have to pursue it. We have to do it in love, because without love, there is no home. And we understand that, don't we? Home is where love is. It's where belonging is. So let's look at a couple other things. We have to do it through constant prayer. Imagine if I got married to my wife, and on our wedding day, I said, all right, we've wrapped this up. If I got any questions, I'll ask, but otherwise, I think we're good. I mean, we recognize that, yes, you are technically married, right? I mean, you're technically, legally married. But there is no relationship there, is there? There's no intimacy. There's no connection. There's nothing. It's just a legal situation. One of the things we talked about this morning in the high school class is this idea of we spend all this time really trying to make sure people understand how to get through the front door, right? Hear, believe, repent, confess, be baptized. Now, we fight this battle every day, right? Because there's always somebody who wants to dispute something. But understand, that's the front door. It's just the front door. There is a whole house, a whole building behind that to be explored and to be understood. God does not want us just to get saved. That's not the end game. That's the beginning. What does he want from us? He wants fellowship. He wants intimacy. He wants connection. He wants us to seek him out. We talked about this in the men's class in February, and I was glad that they picked this topic, because it was talking about drawing near to God. Well, that's not just getting saved. That is what happens after that. That is the effort I put into this. And this is what we're talking about when we talk about prayer. Prayer is me expressing to God how much he means to me. What would happen if the only time you talked to your wife was, well, I have a list of things I need? That's all you offered. Here's a list of things I need you to do this, and so on. I need you to work on that, fix this, and make sure dinner's on time. What is that? How does that, we know in physical terms what that looks like. We know how that plays out. And we laugh about it because it's silliness. But do we not default in prayer like that a lot? God, let me tell you about all the things I need. First, as if he doesn't know, and as if we do. I mean, you ever prayed for anything that you thought you needed and you realized maybe that wasn't such a good plan? What if? What if we spent one day, just one day, and said, God, I am not going to ask you for a single thing. I'm just going to tell you how much I appreciate you, how much I love you, how thankful I am that I am your son. What do you think would happen with our prayer life if we started thinking it more in those terms? Nothing wrong with asking God. No, don't get me wrong, right? He asked us, throw our needs on him, cast our cares on him. He wants that. But what about the relationship? What about spending time with him and talking with him about how much he means to you, how important he is to you, how much you want to seek after him and get to know him? In Romans chapter 12, starting in verse 9, it says, let love be genuine, abhor what is evil, hold fast to what is good, love one another with brotherly affection, outdo one another in showing honor, do not be slothful in zeal, be fervent in spirit, serve the Lord. Rejoice in hope. Be patient in tribulation. Be constant in prayer. Constant in prayer. Always in prayer. How do we do that? We have to build a relationship. I mean, how awkward is it to try and talk to somebody you don't know? I mean, some of you are great at it. I'm not, right? Some of you can walk up to somebody and just strike up a conversation, and kudos to you. You're probably in sales. That's not me. It takes time to develop good conversation, right? It takes time to get to know someone. It takes time to understand how they think. And isn't that what God wants for us? To understand how he thinks, how he sees us, how he sees his church, how he sees the world. Isn't that what we were after? Isn't that what we're seeking? We're not in the business of getting saved and, glad that's over. Brethren, that's just the front door. It's just the front door. There is a whole relationship. And it's no coincidence that the church is referred to as the bride of Christ. That the relationship is a husband to its wife. What do we expect from that if we treat it with disdain, with contempt, if we ignore it? What kind of relationship are we going to have? The only way, brethren, that we can really realize our home is through prayer. Because what is a home without any communication? What is a home without any love, without any hope? What would we say about that place? Is that a place we'd want to be? No, it would not. And finally, last slide. Home is where the soul is. Here on earth, here now, in this physical, temporal place. Home may be where you hang your hat. Home may be where your people are. Maybe it's a house somewhere. Maybe it's some farmstead. It can be anything. When we talk about Abraham and Sarah, we're not talking about property, land, houses. We're talking about something much bigger. And this is what the Hebrew writer was saying. They're looking for something permanent, okay? Permanent as in eternal, not temporary as in here. That's what they are after. So when we talk about these things, we need to understand that, yes, there was a physical leaving that happened. They left where they were and they went somewhere else. But there was a spiritual reason they did it. Matthew chapter 6:19. Lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust destroys, and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. If Job's treasure was in his family and in his possessions and in his notoriety, what's he left with? Nothing. He's gone. His whole person is gone. There's nothing left of him. But that was not the case with him. His treasure, what he hoped for, what he believed, was not here. Oh, I have no doubt he mourned, and we know this. He mourned, and it was excruciating for him. We know that. This doesn't detract from that at all. But understand, his hope was not there. His treasure was not there. There's a passage in Nehemiah chapter 4. And this is one of those another passages. It's like we need to understand it spiritually. It's easy to get lost in a book like Nehemiah and Ezra and Esther, that these things are historical books. And we read them like history. And yes, they happened. They are history. But is that the point? Is the Bible a history book? Is that how we're supposed to view it? That this are just some things that happened and there you go. Well, of course not. What we're looking at here is an account of where they're rebuilding the wall and there's just pressure from all sides. Darkness, if you will, evil, trying to stop them from doing this task that was right and good, that God ordained to be done. And it was to the point where they thought they were going to have to physically fight to defend this place. And Nehemiah says this. He says, "Do not be afraid of them. Remember the Lord, who is great and awesome, and fight for your brothers, your sons, your daughters, your wives, and your homes." Is that just a physical statement that they're just going to have to defend themselves? Is that his point? Was that the Holy Spirit's point when he had this penned? That this was some physical conflict that they had to prepare for? Or was this a bigger issue? We struggle a lot in this world, let's be honest. Life is hard. We suffer. We lose. Things go badly. How do we deal with that? How do we push back? How do we find our way to this place of belonging, to our home where we belong, where our family is? Because isn't that what Nehemiah is talking about? Brothers, sisters, wives, children, home. We have to struggle to get there. There's no easy way. There's no easy button. It's about faith in God. That is, faith that does what God says, when He says, how He says, without understanding why He says. That's what faith is. I know that lately, even in the church, there is a huge push to somehow separate faith and works, that somehow they don't coexist, that they're completely separate ideas, and that is just utterly false. If I don't do what God says to do, I don't have faith. You realize the entire chapter 11 of Hebrews, which we've looked at extensively tonight, is by faith, somebody did something. Now, if they hadn't have done that thing, whatever it was, they didn't have faith. It's really simple. What did James say? He says, without the Spirit, the body is dead. If my spirit departs, this tent is over. If I'm not doing what God asked me to do, my faith would be just the same way. It would be dead. Right? We have to have faith. We have to do what God asked us to do when He asked us to do it. And brethren, that means we don't understand. I hate that. I'll be honest, I really don't like that. I'll do whatever you say as long as I understand why you're asking me to do it and it makes sense. That's my default position. And I am struggling with that, and I got to work on that. I'll be honest. We have to believe that there's something bigger, that there's a hope for us, that there's this home with foundations, this permanency. We have to love. We have to do it. God teaches us how to do it. He shows us how to do it. We have to follow Him to the cross. We have to be in prayer. We have to be in prayer. And brethren, we have to fight. There is darkness everywhere around us. We know this. We see it. We have to keep it out of our homes, our physical homes. We have to keep it out of our spiritual families. This has to be done. We can only do that through prayer, through faith, hope, and through love. Because when we do these things, even though these things seem so basic to us, when we do these things, we will find our way. We will work our way through this darkness, and we will find a permanent home, a home with family, a place of belonging, a place of love, and a place of forgiveness. Thank you all. I appreciate your attention. I appreciate your the willingness to be here and bear with me through all this. These topics, as I said, have become significant to me because when I think about Abraham and Sarah, I just realize, they were people, just people like me. And would I do the things that they did? And I don't know the answer to that, I'm going to be honest. But thank you for being here. If there's anyone who has any needs, if you want prayer of the congregation or you need to confess sin or you're ready to convert yourself to become a believer in Christ, please do so while we stand and sing.